project that our company can implement. Well, when I say that, though, does that encompass a whole lot of different possibilities? So we could go to the extreme. Do we need a 747? Does it carry 4 passengers? Yeah. So what about a Cessna 172 little 4-seater plane? Does it carry 4 passengers? And so maybe we need some additional, they're not functional, but they have this ability to control that solution a little bit. So we might say seating from between 6 to 8 maximum. So we don't go out and buy a 747. So the project doesn't go from, hey, we need to spend $500,000 or $1 million to we're going to spend $400 million. We might say, well, we need to cost no more than some value, 1.6 million. And that sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 1.6 million? Has anybody bought a plane now? They're pretty expensive. I actually have a high school or a college roommate of mine that runs his own charter jet service. Just purchased a new plane last year. $32 million. That's pretty cheap for a plane. He tells me these numbers very casually, as though I'm like, that's a lot of money. And then we have a delivery date. So in other words, it needs to have some constraints. So these non-functional pieces are really just a way we constrain that scope. So we narrow it down. So we still meet the original requirements. So our requirement still is be able to carry 4 passengers cross country, but now we have some constraints on that. And so that's really what we're doing as we start working towards breaking these items down. So one of the things that happens is we could call them technical requirements. And we call them technical requirements. We get them out of these functional requirements. How are we going to solve the problem? So when we design the road and we start getting that project charter, we know that we need such and such a loading so that trucks can pass on. So there may be more than one way we can solve that. We may need a compacted base, we may need 6 inches of asphalt, or we may need another base and 6 inches of concrete. So those kinds of things, those technical, very, very technical requirements. And so here's an example from an ATM. We've all used an ATM. And how many of you say ATM machine? None of you? You might? Yes. It's just one of those weird things that we don't even think about when we're actually saying it. We're going to an automated teller machine. And so if you say you're going to an ATM machine, you're saying I'm going to an automated teller machine. And it's just one of those things that we don't think. Anyway, non-sequitur. So functional requirements. So we need the user to be able to select whether they produce a hard copy transaction receipt before completing the requirement. Well, that's pretty common. You go to the ATM, it gives you a receipt. And you get that choice of whether you want that receipt or not. Now, everybody in here has so much money in the bank, they don't even care about that receipt. They don't even check the balance before they pull out money. Got it. So, but a non-functional requirement might be all the displays shall be in white 14-point Arial text on a black background. So then a technical requirement might be that it will connect to the bank's database system. And so there may be a whole lot of technical pieces beyond that. So that project to build an ATM starts getting a little more complicated. Well, then we may have user requirements. And so most of us are pretty impatient. Would we wait 10 minutes for an ATM to give us money? No. And in fact, if the point of that ATM is to serve customers and possibly generate fees, because if you go to Casey's, what do they charge you? $2, you can get a $20 bill? Something like that. So that ATM is supposed to generate revenue, and if it can only cycle every 10 minutes, it's not going to generate a ton of revenue. So there's two key pieces there. But our ATM requirements may be from the user that it can take no more than 2 minutes to get a standard withdrawal. I can maybe wait 2 minutes. So we may have a business requirement. So provide superior service to our retail customers. This ATM will allow us to increase associated service fee revenues by 10% on an ongoing basis, blah, 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 blah. So in other words, there's our business case for why we're doing that. But there may also be a regulatory requirement. So there may be state, federal, local laws that apply in all those cases. So an ATM certainly has federal laws they have to adhere to. And so some of these things that we say, well, they're a non-functional requirement, all displays shall be in white print. Could that actually be a federal requirement for ADA compliance, that it has a font size or text of a certain height? Could it be that we have to have the keys in Braille? Is that a federal requirement? So regulatory requirements may enable us to do a lot of other things. Well, that certainly happens on almost any project. So I look outside the door and they're still working on our road. Our game of Frogger to get to school is continuing. Are there state rules that require how some of this stuff gets done? Are there a ton of federal rules, including Americans with Disabilities Act rules about how they construct the crosswalk? Now, I really think it's interesting at this point that the crosswalks are sort of resembling the Dukes of Hazzard jumps, but we're getting there slowly. The 2 inches of rain or whatever we got last night. But all of those happen outside our door. So the functional requirement for this project is we wanted to make a smooth transition, eliminate a stop sign, and provide a walkway for students. If I look at technical requirements, well, that's where we get into how much concrete, how much pavers, all those kinds of things do we need. And then we may have regulatory requirements. How wide do the sidewalks have to be to meet compliance? How steep can the little ramps to get from the road up to the sidewalk be? How wide does the road have to be? Are there state requirements on that road about the width? And there certainly are. On that curve, how steep can that curve be? How tight can it be? And we have to look at all those things. The little drop-off zone's pretty neat, but the amount of details to plan and to figure out how to get buses in there is monumental. So these are all different examples of how we start looking at that in terms of breaking it down. And so here again is our work breakdown structure. And just to go over this one more time so everybody's got it, those numbers are how we sequence things. Because we're going to do a lot of stuff in Microsoft Project, Microsoft doesn't order their numbers quite the same way, does it? It just gives you a unique number. But our project charter and our project breakdown generally will be this way. And this gives us a very quick way when I see a number. So if I see 3.4, I know that it's in section 3, and it's the 4, at what level of work breakdown we're talking about. And the whole reason we do this, is we break this down into smaller and smaller tasks so that we can estimate, control, plan, monitor better. Because we can all deal with very small units. And we all know how long it would take to write a small piece of a paper. But we don't know that in totality. So, alternatively, we can write them very similarly this way. It's the same thing. But one of the things we want to work on when we start breaking these down is that idea of brainstorming all of the pieces. And the great thing about every tool we're going to use is you can reorganize those items. So we can change their order. We don't need to worry about precedence quite yet at this stage when you're breaking it out into tasks. But you can certainly organize it this way. So same structure. So notice here we have a third level. And generally we get to that third level, then we're down in task sizes that we can use. The lowest level we call a work package oftentimes. So if you see the word work package, and it's a small enough piece that we can assign it to a person, a team, or a resource of some sort. Those silly numbers. Well, why do we need them? Well, we know we need them at the beginning so we can break a project down into tasks so we can plan for it. But we also use them all the way through the project, everything from accounting, so that we can certainly revalue and look at our values as we're spending money. We may use a number that's already tied to an existing chart of accounts. So if we're a construction company, we may have predefined values for a lot of those. They're already tied to some kind of a chart of accounts. So each work breakdown task or a work package, everything has a unique number. So it's just like in an Access database. Everything's got that unique identifier. Then we can even break it down a little further. So we break it down into build a workbench. And we know that it takes 2 people a day to build a workbench. We can then actually break it down even further. And so we have a lot of examples and things we're going to use. Sometimes that's where we break things down into very small pieces. And we may call in then subject matter experts. How do we build a wheel in our Ford car factory? So we're very small minutia detail with that. But work breakdown tasks are the pieces that we want to concentrate on. Well, when we're starting to brainstorm, order doesn't matter. But when we start putting them together and we start planning, predecessors do that. There's 3 main types. This seems a little odd. There's the idea of finish to start to finish, and finish to finish. What are you talking? So, we have the idea of a finish to start. So, this is our example of taking a shower. We know we have a certain end goal. We know when we need to start. And so we can plan what that finish time is going to be. So, finish to start. We also have things, a start to start. And things that start at the same time. And we have a lot of things that happen. So, if I start handing out tests or notes, I can do that at the same time I talk. I can start 2 tasks out on our construction project at the same time. I can start 2 tasks on a software development project often at the same time. The key, though, is, do I have to quit talking as soon as I hand out the last test? No. And so start to start means we start at the same time, but we don't necessarily finish at the same time. So those task durations may be at significantly different times. And then we have finish to finish. In other words, we have tasks that we need to finish at the same time, but we may need to stagger their start time so it's done correctly. Well, the best example that I can think of is, how many of you have been to a wedding and the song ends, Here Comes the Bride song ends, and the bride's still walking down the aisle? Well, hopefully not. What you want to do is time that so that the bride arrives at the same time the song ends. But does the song begin before she even starts walking? In most cases, yeah. So they end at the same time. So finish to finish means they end at the same time. And you're thinking, well, great, all of this is interesting, but what does it mean to me? There may be a couple of other things we need to deal with. And so sometimes, even in our best intentions, there are other things that are going to affect that predecessor. And so one of them may be an external event. So Your start time is dependent on something else that is out of your control. So an amusement park ride, you can't start riding until the people in front of you get out of the way. We can't start this project out here until the state and local permits are all done. So something that dictates it externally. We may have discretionary predecessors. And sometimes that's simply because somebody in the corporation, somebody in the state, some organization puts a hold on our project at a certain stop. So it could be any number of things. So, any number of reasons. And then we may have mandatory predecessors. So mandatory predecessors sometimes go often hand in hand with that idea of external, because sometimes they really are both involved. So think about a building permit. I have to have all of my framing done before I can call for a framing inspection. But I can't do anything else until that framing inspection is done. So I can't hang the drywall, or I can't do the electrical until that framing inspection is done. And so it's a mandatory predecessor. So all of these have to be done. I am stopped at that point, even though there may be no direct tie-in to what else I'm doing. So if I didn't have that mandatory stop, I might be able to do something, but I can't at that point. And so we'll investigate some of those. So we have the terms lag and lead. So in other words, we have to sometimes lag a process. So we have to wait between processes, because there may not be enough resources available. There may not be enough people available. There may be some other reasons. So sometimes we have to stagger start times or lag one process. And so one example is starting a giant electrical motor. So if I'm down at the water treatment plant and they have 4 giant electrical pumps, I can't kick them on all at the same time, because if I do, it's going to pull so much startup current, the entire city of Peru would go brown. We go, no more power. So we have to stagger them or lag those processes. And so we have to take that into account when we're doing our scheduling. So maybe out here, the construction project is now winter, we're still working on the road. Now we're shoveling snow out of the not done road. And so we only have one starting part to go to all the equipment that's got an engine running and batteries and jumper cables and all that. And so we have to lag that start process in the morning, because we have to go to each machine and start. Sometimes we can do the same thing by leading a process. In other words, starting a task before its predecessor is done. And so depending on the size, how we break those tasks down, sometimes we have additional resources at the end of a project or the end of a task, and we can move them into another area. So we can lag and we can lead processes. We have the term milestone. So that's those significant events, those checkpoints on our project. So where do we check in and really check our progress? So we want to create those. As we're building this project, we want to say, well, this is going to be a milestone, this will be a milestone, and it gives us some time points that we can then check in for both progress in terms of our time, progress in terms of materials, progress in terms of resources spent. And we're going to give you some tools to work with those. But we need some way to be able to check those. And so milestones give us a place to plug in. All right, Hunter, can you pay attention to the screen real quick? Okay. Can you screen for a second? Okay. I told you they were coming. It's a similar thing. So, network diagram. It's just a visual tool to get a grasp on how those activities interrelate. And so all of these tasks are coming from those work packages, those things we break down into those work breakdown structures. Okay. We're going to show you one. I'm going to show you how to do it the easy way. POM, you guys do it kind of the hard way. I'm going to show you how we're going to do it with Microsoft Project, and you'll like it a little bit. So this is a network diagram. So if you haven't seen this before, this is showing us a couple of things. It shows us our start, and it shows us our finish. But what we're trying to do is get an order of those. So now we've introduced predecessors again. So we know that before we can address the invitations, we have to pick a calligrapher. And before we can even get the invitations, we have to find a printer, design the invitations, and print the invitations. And so we have to have both this set of activities and the calligrapher picked out before we can address it. So those things come back together. We have two things that need to be done, so we can have multiple predecessors that need to be done. Then we can address the invitations, and then we can send them. And so this gives us an idea of how things can work and how we can, in some cases, do things in parallel. Because I could certainly be picking the calligrapher and picking the printer at the same time, couldn't I? Maybe. So when we construct those, we have two basic types. So this is what's called an activity on the node. So the node meaning that little box, and it's got the activity. And we don't have all the times or anything else in here yet because I didn't want to scare Hunter. But this is called activity on node. Well, the other model, and I don't know if POM if you guys did this or not. Hunter, did you guys do the activities on arrows? You didn't have to do this one? Okay, so there's an alternative method where all of your items are scattered on the arrows, actually. And it's an alternative method. So you may see this. It's honestly a lot less common, and part of the reason is Microsoft Project and other tools, most of the time will show you a project on nodes. And so we think about it that way. So if you see that activity on arrows in a project, don't panic, it's nothing horrible. Well, once we construct the network diagram, and we know those predecessors, then we can find something called critical path. And critical path, there's a weird way to describe it. So if I come back here, this is the easiest way to look at it. It's off of a network diagram. And we don't have any idea about any of these times. But let's make the crazy assumption for this purpose that each one of those took exactly the same amount of time. So maybe each activity took 1 day. The critical path, so notice we have multiple pathways through here. So we can go through the route that goes start, pick calligrapher, address invitations, or we can go start, pick printer, design invitations, print invitations. The critical path is the longest path through that set of activities. But what's crazy then is if I add up all the time. So if we said each one of these activities was a day, so we'd have 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. That critical pathway, so the longest path through our multiple pathways, is the minimum time for the entire project. So it's kind of a weird thing. We look at the maximum to get the minimum. And I know that seems a little crazy until we work through some of it. So we want to look at how do we get the longest path through, and that's the least amount of time that our project will take at a minimum. So this project will take then, if you want to think of it the other way, at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days to complete. And because we can put some of these tasks at the same time, in this case, just the pick the calligrapher can occur at the same time as these activities. We actually, it's not the sum, our project time is not the sum of all of the tasks, it's the sum of the time through that critical path. And so we're going to work on that over and over again. Critical path, very essential. So we've got our work broken down. We think we're ready to go. And somebody yells out the term, Risk! Oh, is that a board game? Great, I remember Risk. It was a fun game. Well, Risk really has to do with, we're looking at it in terms of the project, what things can impact us and how can they impact us on that project. And so, and a lot of times, we put something like this, we put a matrix up, and what we're doing is, we're looking at a probability. So what is our probability of an event occurring? And then we look at what is the impact of that probability. So let's consider a tornado. Would a tornado on our curve project have a significant impact? Okay, notwithstanding that they're behind schedule, let's envision that the project, we're planning it to start with. We think we're going to be working in tornado season. So I'm going to say we probably don't have a 90% chance of a tornado hitting us in Peru. Let's say we have a 10% chance. But is the impact of a tornado hitting us very high? So if a tornado hit, so we could say, oh, well, all right. So we have a score then that we can actually assign weights then to that cost estimate. Ooh, so let's look at another example. What is the chance that we're going to have rain during this project? Good. And in fact, I'd say at some point, we probably have a 90% chance of rain. And then I need to think about how that's going to impact us. So does a chance of rain, is it a very low impact on our dirt work? Can we work in the mud? Can we really do much dirt work in the mud? No. So in fact, I'm going to say, and we're going to be artificially high, we're going to say it's very high. And if I look at that cross section then, notice we're a very high number. So the higher we get up here into this dark area, the more impact it has on our project. So we need some way to then just start looking at that risk and how do we deal with it. So our original work breakdown, we had all the pieces out here, and we said that project is going to take 100 days. If I really start looking at that risk, and I think we're going to have a lot of risk from rain and other external events, does that 100 days, is that realistic anymore? No. And so we need some ways that we can work around and try to find some of them. So we have some risk responses that we're going to look at. So you'll see that at the beginning, what we're trying to tie this together is we want to identify all the risks. So we'll kind of do that brainstorming again. What are all of our risks? We're going to plan for them, and those all feed into our responses. So we identify all the risks, we identify the likelihood, what our responses are, and that feeds into a plan for those risks. Starts getting a little involved. But the reality is, if we came out here and we said, well, we think it's going to take 100 days to build this project. And in a lot of cases, contracts have punishment clauses. So if our construction company had to pay $1,000 a day in a fine because that project wasn't done, would that motivate me then to have risk responses and to bid better? Very likely. So we also have to think about this question. Are all threats negative? Can a threat also be an opportunity in some cases? Are there times when a threat is an opportunity? And so I want you to think about that a little bit. So the basic strategies we're going to have for risk. And these will identify our plan and how we're going to work with them. So we can avoid risk. You guys avoid risk in your own lives, don't you? So the risk of jumping off of a cliff into the Missouri River and drowning, I can avoid that. And I can avoid that really quickly by just not doing it, right? So the ultimate way to avoid risk is to not do a project. But maybe there's better things I can do. And so maybe I can change the project up front to minimize some of those risks. So could I time my project out here on the curve even? Because I know I can't work in the winter, so I don't schedule it in the winter. So I'm avoiding that risk by only scheduling that project in the summer months. So avoidance we generally try to do up front. We try to find changes so we can avoid risk as much as possible. We can transfer risk. And every one of you, hopefully, is transferring risk right now. Because you guys have bought car insurance. So if I run into somebody out here in a car, and it costs me $25,000 to replace their car, I don't have to write a check for $25,000, do I? No. Because I bought insurance, and so I pay my deductible, and then they write a check to the other person. I transfer that risk to somebody else. So how many of you noticed that the Full Throttle Saloon burned down last week? A couple of you? Well, one of the interesting things that I saw in a lot of chat forums, for whatever reason I was bored and it was late at night, was the owner claims he didn't have insurance on the building. And that's pretty common, unfortunately, with commercial buildings because it's very, very expensive to insure them for fire and theft and those kinds of things. But the discussion was, well, he should have had insurance if he can afford rain insurance. And you as a business owner can purchase things like rain insurance for special events. So what happens to your income if it rains and you can't have a concert? So almost every outdoor venue that has concerts purchases rain insurance. Farmers can buy crop insurance in this area. So in other words, you're transferring that risk. So other things you do. Warranties. So you buy a new car, and one of the things you're getting with that is you're hopefully not having to repair it under your own dollar, right? Because you have that warranty. You buy a new product, you get that warranty. So we're transferring risk again to somebody else. We may do something called a performance bond. So a lot of construction companies, when they go to bid a job, it's specified they have to have a performance bond. And this one's a little odd, so let's think about this. So the construction company out here building this project had to put up a bond. So they went essentially to an insurance company and said, I need a $1 million performance bond. And so they put that up, and so they'll pay their insurance premium for it, whatever it is. If it doesn't meet specifications, so the road falls apart before it's ever built, or they don't meet a time specification in a lot of cases, Peru then would have the ability to remove that contractor and pay for that job being done from that performance bond. Now, if a construction company has that happen several times, are they going to be able to get a bond? No. But it's a way to ensure that that job gets done, so we transfer risk. We may hire a third party. So we may have tasks that we don't know how to do very well. And you can certainly see it out there. Is it all one company you see out there working on this project? You see a lot of different companies. We transfer risk, so tasks that we don't know how to do very well maybe. So maybe we're not really good at laying storm drains, and we don't want to take that risk of the town flooding. We hire a company that specializes. or we don't know how to do tunnels, or whatever it is in construction, or we're a web design firm and we don't know how to do database development. We put that to somebody else. And even the original contract, we need to think about, because there's a couple of different ways we can set up a contract. And who has the risk becomes interesting. How many of you have taken 251 commercial law? Commercial law? No. Lauren, you started reading it. No. So contract law. If I set a fixed price contract, so I tell Peru that I'm going to build this curb for $1 million. And as a construction company, I've set a fixed price, and it costs me $1.5 million to build this road. Who bears that risk? That fixed price contract. Who bears the risk? Does the person doing the contract, or the person that owns the job eventually? So out here, it'd be that construction company on a fixed price contract bears that risk. And so you're going to see, in those cases, they're going to try to come up with some way to transfer or fix that risk. Cost plus is a different way to do a contract. Cost plus says, whatever it takes to build that road, I'm going to add 10% to it, and that's what we're going to charge you. So in that case, it's the owner, not the contractor, who bears that cost. And we have some fixed cost contracts around here. So the contract we have with the food service department over at the cafeteria says, whatever it costs to run this cafeteria plus X percentage, that's what the college is going to pay. So if we can transfer that risk, contracts are a really great way to do it. Insurance, we can mitigate the risk. And again, we're trying to reduce that possibility that something's going to happen. So we can mitigate the risk. So maybe we have a risk assessor on team, maybe we bring, because we're really worried about employees getting injured on the job, we bring in a health and safety inspector every day. And then one of the last strategies is just to accept it. We know that it's going to happen. And one of the ways we can handle that is by putting in something called a contingency fund. And so in a lot of projects, so our project's going to be $1 million, we put in an extra 10% as a contingency fund. And we say, well, we figure that there's going to be some risks. We're not going to identify them all. We're not going to be able to plan for them all. Let's just put in 10% extra for contingencies or things that arise we don't know about, and let's see if we can figure out a way to solve them. And so contingency funds are another way we can mitigate risk. Open. So everybody saved their documents in Microsoft Project. So let's look at a couple of them. I'm just opening them up in the other window, of course. And some of you don't have 10 tasks in here. Interesting. So let's look at a couple of things we needed. So I asked to have 10 different tasks in there of what we could do out here on this project. So some of these, and if I say get assessment of resources needed, can I break that down into more specific items? Could that be almost a milestone? Get assessment of resources. And this is new. Most of you haven't done this, so don't take offense to it. But could I get assessment of resources needed? Because I have a week listed on that. Maybe I break that down into smaller tasks. So if I'm breaking our road project down, get assessment of resources needed might break down into Identify permits needed. Identify state requirements for roads needed. So smaller tasks that we can assign. So these need to be very specific about those individual pieces. These are broken down into the scale of how do I assign it to an individual person. So let's take a look at this example. And they actually put some predecessors in there thinking about what things they needed to have. So evaluate project. Well, I'm not sure what they mean by evaluate project, but I'm assuming that means look at the plans and decide what they need to do in terms of resources, both personnel and resources, because they've got bricks and they've got tear out old road, level road. So let's look at this one. Here we go. Evaluate project 1 day. All right. So you've got the plans. A lot of times the term you hear is called stripping the plan. And stripping the plans means you identify the requirements for resources. So order brick, 30 minutes. Okay. Hire crew. Well, that's very possible. So your crew may take 7 days to hire. That seems like a reasonable response. But I can't hire the crew until I've evaluated the project and I know how many people I need, right? So that seems to make sense that that has to be a predecessor of number 1. We also need the ordering the brick. We can't order the brick until we evaluate the project. And then, I'm guessing you guys said assign tasks. So in other words, assign pieces to each person, right? Yes, okay. So that's a day. You get everybody together, you figure out who you've got hired. Okay. Tear out old road 1 day. You must have hired the best constructors ever. Ah, nice. Nice. No. And at some point then we start looking at how do we evaluate those numbers. So for now, 1 day is great. And the best thing about Microsoft Project is, well, you know, I'm looking at this and I go, you know, that doesn't seem right. Can I change tear out road to, if I can get my mouse to cooperate from here, to a month. I can change that very, very quickly. I can say 1 month. And Microsoft Project even takes the word month and makes my life easy. I don't have to say 30 days. And so we had that in there, 1 month. But I'll point out there's something weird about it when I use months in project. Notice the dates. Friday 10/2 to 10/29. It assigns 4 weeks of the month, which is an oddity. So it doesn't just strictly go month by month. But so when you look at those units, sometimes it's better to stay in days than try to do it in months. That's my rule. So level out ground, prepare for brick, cut brick. So all of these pieces have predecessors. So mixed concrete. Certainly we have to mix it before we can lay the brick. But are there mandatory things that could happen in there? When we get ready to pour concrete out here on a road, are there tests they perform on that concrete before they pour it in the road? Yeah. They actually do a couple of very quick ones. They do what's called a slump test. And they may look at what's called the batch ticket from the factory, and they may go, oh, you put extra water in there, we can't take it. And so there may be a mandatory stop in there that adds time that we don't normally account for. So if I look up here, can I rearrange these order of these tasks pretty easily? Is there an easy way to do that? So for whatever reason, I've decided that I can lay the brick before I mix the concrete. Can I flip-flop the order of these tasks really easily? can I cut and paste into these lines? Have we tried? Open up project and let's try. So open up your project and see if you can just flip-flop some of these tasks. So can I do this? So cut. Notice I can cut that completely out of there. I can insert rows. I can paste rows. So it gives us a lot of ability to move details around. So even after we get done with this, so if we use this as our tool to begin with, although I'm going to still recommend you always do paper, you can certainly move things around. I can change times. I can change this start date. So that start date was automatically generated. If I know that I need to start on a specific date, I can change that. And notice it changes that entire chart. So what is this name of this chart over on the right-hand side called? A Gantt chart. Is that the only thing Microsoft Project can show itself? So up on the top left under View, there's a couple of things we haven't even started looking at. Because not only can I put all these individual tasks, notice I have a lot of forms, and I can have tracking, resource forms, because we're going to find out we can add additional detail to this, including who gets assigned a task. And we'll see how well it works with this one. Change my view a little bit here. So remember those network diagrams you had to construct in project management or operations management? We can actually construct one right here. And it does that activity on node. So in other words, each one of those is a node. And notice what it even does for us. It shows us that red line. It shows us that critical path. Well, that's pretty nifty. Why didn't I have that when I had operations management? I could have plugged in those tasks, those predecessors, gotten a network diagram, and been done in 10 seconds. And yet we made you do it by hand. Well, you have to understand how it works before we get to that particular point. So, Microsoft Project can do all of those tasks. We can reorder. We can go back to our Gantt chart. The other interesting view is to look at it as in terms of a calendar. And so sometimes that Gantt chart is interesting when we overlay it on a calendar. Because it shows us, we tend to be very visual, and this seems to represent a little better how our mind operates on a month. But notice that something weird happens here. And I don't know why they do this, but remember we have it set up right now, so Saturday and Sundays are non-working days, correct? But yet your project is showing sliding right through Saturday and Sunday. So this activity that's supposed to take 7 days, according to the calendar, looks like it takes longer. So it's one of those things when you look at it, you have to go, oh yeah, we'll fix that. So for most things, it's a handy way to quickly find end dates. But most of the time, we end up staying in this Gantt chart. And remember, you can always scroll to the right and look through those timelines. You can also reduce the size of that chart over here. So these little zoom in and out sliders, as we get a more complicated project, are going to be valuable. And then you can move these dividers. So if I have all this done and I know these and I really want to study the Gantt chart, the other handy thing I can do is move that over and I can look at it. So if I open up project and I only see task names and I don't see all the details about it, I can move them over. And when I move it over here, notice I start opening up and I start getting some additional items also in project screenshot. All right. How many of you started on the homework assignment? Okay. You have every tool now to do that homework assignment that's in Blackboard. So if I come up here to Blackboard and I move it over to the right spot, open. So, number one, you have to create a breakdown, work breakdown. We've talked about it. You can certainly do that. You get to pick what you're going to do that on. Then we have, this is really nothing more than an expected value problem, isn't it? So you can figure out what the expected cost, and what you're looking for in this case is the lowest cost from all these possibilities. So A, B, C, or D. What is the possibility of all of those? And then we have the biggest piece, this word problem. And so this word problem really is your first chance to use Microsoft Project. Although I'm still going to tell you it might be easier to sketch it out very quickly, at least your work breakdowns. Scroll down. So this project involves Vern. And so Vern has to come up, he's got a project, he's tasked with fixing it, and so he's going to use Microsoft Project. So you need to read through that. Sometimes I find in these word problems, it's very handy to actually take this problem and sketch out your important information on the side. I go, well, I know I have these dates, so it's identifying what's important and what's valuable. All right, so when you turn this in, you're going to need to turn in a project 13 file for this one, plus some other information. So you're going to need a Word file for the rest of it, plus a piece of this, and a Microsoft Project file. So do not hit submit until you've uploaded both documents. Blackboard won't let you go back in and go, oops, I made a mistake, unfortunately. All right, any questions on the homework assignment? Seems clear as mud. All right, so there are all kinds of resources down here, including there's an expected value problem, so another one. There's quick, there's a project tutorials. The first 4 videos, though, I was hoping Microsoft would fix that, and apparently they have yet to rectify that. These came out of Microsoft. They worked on Wednesday, so we saw the guy who couldn't figure out how many days there were in a weekend. The next day, suddenly they turned up as private, so somebody made a change there. What I thought was interesting was that it's a Microsoft blog, and they're posting their videos on YouTube.